The United States and its allies engaged in a long and costly war in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. The U.S. entered World War II following a serious incident in the East. In 1937, the Japanese sank the USS Panay, a warship on the Yangtze River, resulting in American fatalities even before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. 11 men and a civilian passenger were seriously injured, and 2 American sailors lost their lives. The incident raised fears of war. President Roosevelt lodged a formal protest, and Japan accepted responsibility, offering $2,247.36 in compensation for death, injury, and property damage. Once the U.S. was fully involved in the war, reclaiming territories occupied by Japan became a national priority. Nearly a year before American troops faced German soldiers in ground combat, the U.S. Marine Corps led numerous amphibious assaults on remote Pacific islands. These missions were met with fierce resistance from Japanese troops who refused to surrender. By mid-1942, Japan had captured Wake, Guam, Bataan, and Corregidor, taking hundreds of Marines prisoner. But momentum began to shift. America's first major offensive of the war, Operation Watchtower, aimed to seize and hold Guadalcanal and nearby positions in the Florida Islands, including Tulagi, Tanambogo, Gavutu, and the Santa Cruz Islands. This would deny the Japanese strategic points and establish U.S. bases for future campaigns. A general in the 1st Marine Division addressed his men, stating that this operation marked the first American ground offensive and would serve as a model for others. He emphasized that only victory was acceptable, as the Marines, wearing their distinct camouflage-covered helmets, descended from transport ships into landing craft. They faced enemy fire from bombers and naval guns. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Yoshimoto of Japan's Special Naval Landing Force was awakened by his aide, reporting strange ships near Savo Island. As Yoshimoto reached the communication post, explosions knocked him to the ground. However, the initial landing on Guadalcanal met little resistance. One war correspondent described it as anticlimactic, with Japanese forces retreating into the jungle almost immediately. Major Ray Davis recalled the airfield under construction was taken without a fight and later named Henderson Field after Lofton Henderson, killed at Wake Island. But the quiet didn't last. Japanese forces counterattacked from land, sea, and air over the next 6 months. Davis's unit was tasked with defending Henderson Field from low-flying aircraft. The U.S. used mechanical fire control systems, but their accuracy diminished above 4,000 feet. Japanese bombers soon adjusted, flying at 23,000 feet. The harsh environment took a toll. Many Marines, including Davis, fell ill with diarrhea, malaria, and hepatitis. Medical logs showed 6,000 Marines were hospitalized within 3 months, most for malaria. Japanese troops proved to be relentless and skilled jungle fighters. They consistently launched attacks, refusing to remain on the defensive. Eventually, after half a year of brutal combat, the Japanese were forced to evacuate. The U.S. lost 29 ships, 615 planes, and about 7,100 troops. Japan suffered heavier losses, 31,000 troops, 38 ships, and 683 planes. War correspondent Hanson Baldwin described the Japanese as ruthless and dangerous opponents. Operation Watchtower also included Operation Ringbolt, aimed at capturing Tulagi. Early on August 7th, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion landed unopposed. Major Justice Chambers noted the Japanese had expected landings elsewhere on the island. As the raiders advanced, a green flare signaled Japanese resistance. They encountered fierce machine gun fire and discovered that Japanese snipers had hidden themselves in coconut trees, taking advantage of their small size. Despite intense enemy fire, the raiders pressed on. By mid-afternoon, they captured a golf clubhouse previously used by the Japanese, finding personal items and supplies left behind. As night fell, the Marines prepared for renewed combat by placing ammunition and grenades strategically. They used passwords containing the letter L, which Japanese troops struggled to pronounce. Around 11 p.m., 2 raider companies were struck hard when Japanese forces attacked the weak spot between their lines. However, the strongest part of the Marine position withstood the brunt of the assault. After repelling 2 major attacks, the surviving Japanese retreated into caves and bunkers. By the next afternoon, Tulagi was secured, but at a cost. 38 raiders were killed and 55 wounded. Of the estimated 350 Japanese defenders, only 3 survived. Fighting for control of the Solomon Islands continued through 1942 and much of 1943. It was brutal, but ultimately the Americans prevailed. Operation Galvanic followed, aimed at capturing Tarawa and Baitio. The 2nd Marine Division led the assault, marking the first time American forces landed on a well-defended atoll. Their actions would serve as a model for future Pacific operations. As the Marines approached, they came under long-range machine gun fire. Amphibious tractors hit coral reefs and Japanese defenses. One coxswain panicked and dropped the ramp too soon, causing many Marines burdened with gear to drown. Survivors took cover behind a seawall made of coconuts. The landing plan failed, but amidst the chaos, junior officers and enlisted men took initiative, pushing forward despite heavy losses. A civilian war correspondent remarked on the Marines' incredible bravery as they charged Japanese positions again and again until they were physically unable to continue. Tanks played a crucial role in securing the beaches. Marine Shermans reached shore and engaged enemy tanks. One Sherman, called China Gal, helped destroy several pillboxes before being hit and set ablaze. By the 3rd day, the island was declared secure. Around 4,600 Japanese died, while American casualties reached about 3,300. The next objective was the capture of the islands of Roy Namur and Kwajalein, part of the largest atoll in the world. The 4th Marine Division took on Roy Namur, while the 7th Infantry Division was assigned to Kwajalein. Despite having 3,000 well-trained defenders, the Japanese lacked proper beach defenses, underwater mines, or tunnels. After 2 days of relentless bombing, the 24th Marines landed on Namur and the 23rd on Roy. While progress was steady, strong enemy positions still had to be overcome. One battalion encountered a massive concrete blockhouse, with 3-foot-thick walls blocking their advance. Although it had sustained some damage from naval gunfire, Lieutenant Colonel Edward J. Dillon, the battalion commander, ordered Company G to ensure the structure was fully destroyed. 5 rounds from a 75mm half-track were fired at the steel door. A demolition squad, covered by fire, climbed through a shell hole on the roof, pushed Bangalore torpedoes in, and placed satchel charges at the gun ports. After pulling the igniters, the squad ran for safety. A massive explosion followed, killing 20 Marines and injuring many more. Some men caught out in the open were killed by falling debris, and others in small boats offshore were also killed or wounded. A pilot observing the aftermath radioed that it seemed the entire island had exploded. The blast sent bombs, torpedo warheads, and huge chunks of concrete into the sky, casting a thick, inky black cloud over the area. An eyewitness reported that all that remained of the large blockhouse was a crater filled with water. It turned out to have been a torpedo warhead magazine, which the demolition squad had not known. While the Marines attempted to recover from the blast, 2 more concrete bunkers erupted, likely triggered by Japanese forces. These 3 explosions together caused half the total casualties suffered by one landing team in the mission. Despite this disaster, the Marines secured the island of Roe in 48 hours, with 195 men killed and 545 wounded. The Japanese lost 3,472 killed and 91 captured. Operation Forager, a campaign covering the islands of Tinian, Guam, and Saipan, marked a critical point in the Pacific. Saipan was especially important because it would become the first B-29 base in the region. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed after 3 days of intense naval and air bombardment. On the lower west coast of Saipan, the 2nd Marine Division deployed the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 6th Marine Regiment, and the 4th Division deployed the 23rd and 25th Marines. The beaches were code-named Blue and Yellow, corresponding to the unit's designated landing areas. 68 armored amphibians armed with 37mm and 75mm cannons formed the lead wave. Behind them came 196 troop-carrying amphibious tractors in 4 waves. As the first wave reached the reef, there was no Japanese fire. Then everything erupted. Tiny colored flags marked gun targets the Japanese had pre-planned. Suddenly, artillery, mortars, and small arms fire poured down on the Marines. Accurate return fire was nearly impossible due to the bouncing caused by coral heads beneath the water. Some shells exploded just in front of the Marines, others went nearly vertical. Still, their fire and presence had a strong psychological impact. Japanese radio transmissions, intercepted by U.S. naval monitors, described massive tanks and monster guns closing in. Explosions dotted the water. Marines rushed forward through chaos. Some soldiers in short-sleeved shirts and steel helmets stood confused under fire. One Marine began firing his machine gun instinctively. Japanese artillery continued pounding, sending up water through open hatches. Assault waves behind the first group suffered even greater losses. The battle on Saipan quickly became one of annihilation. At 8:43, the Marines hit the beach. They barely managed to establish a toehold. Lieutenant General Holland Smith recalled that the strategy was simply to hold on through that first critical day. Neil Mumford recounted seeing an armored amphibian on fire with someone trying to escape from the hatch. Ammunition began to detonate. A shell hit his own vehicle, forcing his crew to abandon it, only to discover they were safer inside than out. Marines pushed inland toward the 0-1 line, their objective for day 1. A Japanese soldier described the American advance as like a swarm of grasshoppers. The beach was under grazing machine gun fire. First Lieutenant John C. Saipan described the carnage. Twisted bodies of Marines and Japanese, burning pillboxes, shattered vehicles, and scorched sand littered with gear. Del G. Jam recalled being hit directly by a shell, sending men sprawling. Shells began falling around them constantly, roaring like freight trains. Digging into the sand with their chins and elbows, Marines clawed for cover. Some positions were only a few yards deep, and progress inland was measured yard by yard. Holland Smith described artillery and mortar shells landing every 3 seconds for the first 20 minutes. Journalist Robert Sherrod noted that most fell in the water, but a few struck dangerously close. One battalion aid station was set up in a deep tank trap. Wounded Marines lay bleeding, waiting for evacuation. Captain John A. Magruder saw a young Marine who had recently arrived, lying dead with a book in his back pocket titled "Our Hearts Were Young and Gay." Over 2,000 casualties were suffered by the 2nd Division alone, 553 killed and 1,022 wounded. 31 of the 68 armored amphibians were lost. 5 of the infantry unit commanders were injured. The beachhead wasn't considered secure for another 3 days. Holland Smith described enduring constant strain. Colonel E.A. Craig recalled being blown into a ditch by a satchel charge thrown by a Japanese soldier emerging from a cave. As Marines returned fire, a jeep-mounted anti-tank gun fired into the cave, eventually revealing a tunnel full of Japanese dead. Later, Craig's unit spotted camouflaged Japanese tanks advancing. A bazooka team acted with calm speed and destroyed them. Other Marines climbed on the tanks and cleared the hatches with grenades. 2 additional unmanned tanks dug into the hillside were later found. In the battle for Guam, 3,000 American lives were lost. From September to November 1944, in the Battle of Peleliu, modern-day Palau, 18,000 troops from the Army's 81st Infantry Division and the 1st Marine Division fought against 11,000 Japanese soldiers. A funeral pyre of over 20 burning amphibious vehicles sent black smoke into the sky near White Beaches 1 and 2. The 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Major Raymond Davis, advanced through constant shelling. Japanese heavy weapons had been positioned to cover the approach between the reef and the shore. Mortar shells struck multiple vehicles. When Davis stepped off a vehicle, a mortar splinter pierced his knee, but after treatment, he returned to action. Company A advanced toward a Japanese anti-tank ditch. The Japanese had set up overlapping fields of fire from both flanks and ridges. The ditch was heavily fortified, and Marines suffered serious casualties before being halted. The enemy had entrenched themselves below coral ridges, setting up crossfire from hidden positions. Surgeon Robert W. Riley directed a machine gun into action to pin the enemy, and a tank was dispatched to support the unit. Riley was later promoted to platoon commander after all other leaders were killed or wounded. Before being injured by grenade shrapnel, he led some of the campaign's hardest fighting. Oberon, with the 2nd Squad of the 1st Platoon under Paul and Quaid, successfully breached a coral ridge and continued forward, refusing to yield their left flank. They established contact with Company E and held their position by forming 4 fire groups that maintained visual contact across 200 yards of terrain. The area was secured by noon the following day. They held off all Japanese attempts to dislodge them through the night. After Company A was defeated, Company B launched an assault but faced the same fate. According to his Navy Cross citation, Corporal Herbert B Goff braved intense enemy fire in an attempt to outflank the Japanese troops. He positioned his men for maximum effectiveness and led a courageous attack. Despite his efforts, Company B had to retreat. Knowing his squad's firepower wasn't enough to take out the fortified enemy position, Goff advanced alone with only grenades and a submachine gun. He successfully destroyed the enemy emplacement and its crew before being fatally wounded. A historian later noted the battle's high death toll and questionable strategic value, calling it one of the war's most controversial. The island had the highest casualty rate of any Pacific battle given the number of men involved. 8 medals of honor were awarded. Nearly 2,330 Americans died, and about 8,450 were wounded. Only 202 Japanese soldiers survived. Some analysts argued that the island should have been bypassed and left to weaken over time. If that battle was brutal, the next was even more so. The Marines faced the most heavily fortified position of the entire war. Lieutenant General Holland Smith described it as the most savage and costly battle in Marine Corps history. William Manchester once described the island as a foul lump of cold lava in the sea. The question remains, why was this tiny piece of land worth the cost? Over the years, the Japanese had constructed miles of tunnels, artillery positions, pillboxes, bunkers, supply depots, command posts, hospitals, and living quarters using Korean forced labor. 3 airfields, including one under construction, made the island an ideal base for bombing operations. To counter this, 6 battleships and 5 cruisers unleashed 14,000 shells, the most intense naval bombardment of the war at that point. Amid moderate ocean swells, landing craft carrying Marines and underwater demolition teams bobbed in the water, waiting for the signal to move in. When it came, their diesel engines roared to life. Sergeant Charles A. Lindner, a sniper and scout with the 5th Marine Division, recalled seeing the beach silhouette and Mount Suribachi rising 550 feet above, known as Hot Rocks. As they approached, he saw explosions and suspected artillery hidden in caves. Their boats maneuvered between camouflaged landing craft as 250,000 Marines prepared to storm the island. The defenders soon opened up with mortar and artillery fire, turning the black sand red with blood. The landing craft were quickly damaged. Within minutes, 3 were hit and 9 rendered inoperable. The swimmers and Marines were suddenly left without support and dangerously exposed. Lindner recalled bullet splashes in the water and the need to evacuate. War journalist Richard Newcomb described how a corporal and a sergeant ran to a pillbox, planted explosives, and were wounded or killed in the process. On the 23rd at 8 a.m., a patrol from Company E raised a small American flag on Suribachi. Later, a larger one was raised. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal followed the second group and captured the iconic image of the flag raising. He noticed the Marines fastening the flag to a pipe, lifted his camera to waist level, and took the photo. He later said, "You don't realize at the time that you've taken something historic." Though the photo quickly became famous, he had to clarify that it was not staged, as some believed. Unfortunately, the flag raising did not mark the end of fighting. It took nearly 3 months to secure the island, with over 6,800 Marines killed and more than 19,000 wounded. Very few Japanese survived. The naval guns of Task Force 58 began bombarding Okinawa's beaches before the landing. Carrier planes flew overhead, bombing known and suspected targets. Vice Admiral Richard K. Turner gave the command to land. The scene was chaotic, with boats crisscrossing and troops descending cargo nets into landing crafts. More than 1,400 landing craft formed waves behind control boats, waiting for the signal. At 8 a.m., control boats dropped their pennants, and the first wave of amphibious tractors surged forward. Behind them came hundreds more, carrying troops toward the shore. A Japanese soldier later wrote that it felt like a frog facing a snake. On Mount Suri, Japanese commanders observed the landing calmly, some even smoking and joking. They had spent months building their strongest defensive position in the surrounding hills. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima noted the bombardment's intensity, calling it vast and oddly magnificent. Gunboats fired rockets and mortars into targeted grid squares, saturating the beach with explosives. Once close to the reef, the gunboats moved aside, and the amphibious tanks advanced. By 8:39, the first waves had landed on all beaches, meeting little resistance. According to initial reports, units moved quickly inland, experiencing what many called a cakewalk. Robert Sherrod, a journalist on the scene, noted he had already lived longer than he expected. Despite expectations of 80 to 85% casualties, 10th Army landed 16,000 combat troops in the first hour with minimal losses. Yahara, a senior Japanese staff officer, wrote that American troops were unaware the Japanese had withdrawn and were waiting in the hills to ambush them. The trap was set. Up to 100,000 Japanese civilians died in the crossfire. By the end of the 82-day battle, between 14,000 and 20,000 Americans were dead. But the battle had brought the war to Japan's doorstep. The Marine Corps and Navy had spent 2 decades refining amphibious tactics, preparing for just this kind of warfare. That expertise allowed for the island-hopping strategy that ultimately helped defeat Japan.